Evangelism. It's an interesting word. It comes from the Greek euangelion, which means good news. That is the word that we're going to consider in today's brief devotional. Good news, or as we often call it, gospel. Good news, gospel, it's not a style of music, though, I guess they use the word for that. No, and it's not something that just means good news either, as if you were to receive good news from the newspaper or in a letter. No, it means something much deeper than these superficial words would seem, and especially when used by the New Testament authors. In the Old Testament, the word is used a few times in the Hebrew. It's referred to very literally good news, perhaps maybe like in the newspaper, illustration. One that is often, though, given with great zeal or joy. And then in the New Testament, we run into one that perhaps should have zeal and joy, but has a much deeper meaning used behind it. In the New Testament, the phrase good news or gospel, which does come from evangelion, is used about 70 times in different forms in the New Testament. And most of the times that it's used, it's referring to the good news that comes from Jesus Christ, specifically the good news that we as Christians have. But in order to understand why the story of Jesus is good news, I believe we have to understand why our situation we're in without him is bad news. In the first good news sermon that was preached in Acts chapter 2, Peter did something unique while finishing up his sermon. Throughout the sermon, he began by teaching from the beginning and moving to the fact that Jesus Christ was in fact the Son of God, the King, the Messiah come. And that's great, except for the fact of the accusation that came at the end of his sermon. If you look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 36, it reads like this: "Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ." Now for us, that might not seem that big of a deal, but for those who were hearing, they were being accused of crucifying Jesus Christ, the Lord, the King, the Son of God. Now imagine finding out the way that these guys did, that you cheered on the murder of this man. You cheered during the trial that he was to be crucified. And that man that you did that to was actually God himself in the flesh. You would be, as they were perhaps, cut to the heart. Why? Because you've done something terrible. And not only did you condemn an innocent man, but that innocent man happens to be the Son of God. You would think that God is probably going to squish you like a bug, kill you where you stand, sends you to an eternal hell. And because of that, it changes your perspective. We must remember, though, that all sin, like any transgression, deserves punishment. And just like those people were cut to the heart, so should we because of our sin. We may not have been the ones who actually vocalized, crucify him, but through our sin, we pinned him to that cross. And we've all sinned, haven't we? Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 convicts us all of it when Paul wrote that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We all require a sacrifice, and it was because of that sacrifice that is required that Jesus died on the cross. So every one of us, when we realize this, when we realize that it was for our sin that Jesus was crucified, we should understand that our punishment is great. It's what we deserve. It's what a holy God should give us. An eternal hell. A second death, that death punishment that should come because of our great sin. But then the gospel steps in. The good news about this terrible situation that you're in is that you don't have to be squished like a bug. You don't have to die. You don't have to live in eternity in hell. Because of Jesus' perfect sacrifice, you can have forgiveness. Imagine having a business loan, for example, that you took out, and it got out of hand. Maybe you made one mistake, or maybe you made many. Either way, now the debt is so large that there is no way to pay it back. And then someone comes along and says, well, you don't have to pay it back. I've cleared your debt. You would shout for joy. You would have to tell everyone about this good news that you've heard, and it would make you so joyful in your life. And that it is. It's the good news that you have received. In the same way, if not even better, the gospel message comes to us. And at that, just as in the previous story, lives the heart of God's grace, the message of the gospel, the good news that death has no reign over us because Jesus rose again. And so those people in Acts chapter 2, when they heard this message, that they didn't have to worry about it anymore. Their hearts that were cut in Acts chapter 2, they found a terrible way out of that terrible debt through the death of Jesus Christ. And by being baptized into him, they had that forgiveness of their sin, the debt wiped away. And that was the good news for them today. And they were thankful. They were joyful. The church was in such commotion in good ways in the early days. They ate their bread with contentment of heart. They shared. They met daily. They were sharing in all things. The good news affected them so wonderfully. You know, the other thing about good news is that you got to share it. You can't help yourself. Don't tell me those people couldn't help but share the wonderful news that they had heard. And consider it again, those who have been paying attention on our sermons in the past few weeks. Remember the one on the Great Commission? Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16 says, "And he said to them, 'Go into all the world and to preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned.'" So if you've heard the good news and responded in belief, in baptism, in obedience to God's will, and all the things that he desires of you, take that gospel with zeal and joy and give it to the world, because good news is worth sharing, isn't it? Not only have we been commanded to, but it's worth sharing because of what God has done with you. I hope that you're so joyful about the good news that you can't hold it back, that there's not a person in this world that you don't want to share it with. I've always heard it said that the gospel is unique in that. It's a gift that the more that you share it, the better it gets. I hope that you want to go to heaven. I hope that the good news affects you, that you can have a relationship with God as long as you're in his Son. And thankfully, because of what Jesus did, because he died on the cross as a sacrifice, because he was resurrected and showed his power over death, that we can have that as well. If you need to contact us, please do so. If there's something that we can do for you, if there's some way that you need to hear more about this gospel, this good news, let us help you. And for those of you who are listening, I hope that you are encouraged and have a wonderful week. Thank you very much.